Thank you very much, McKeel. Thank you for the introduction. I'm looking forward to the opportunity for questions and maybe even some from the audience if we don't cover everything that you might be interested in. I can only echo what McKeel said. YPO truly has been an organization that has given the opportunity to many individuals from across the globe who have businesses but are interested not only in lifelong learning but going even further, not just in business but in life. And I am someone who thinks that that's a great purpose to have to anyone's life, to constantly be pushing your own boundaries and trying to determine what more you can learn and how you can apply it. I want to make just a very few brief comments. In thinking about coming here today, I was really struck by the debates that we are having, not only in our country, but in many parts of the world, about how we are going to live together, how we're going to create more opportunity, particularly economic opportunity, how we're going to continue to be creative and innovative, and give even more people the chance to live up to their own God-given potential. There are always challenges in answering those questions, but in the world today, it seems like they are perhaps more acute and certainly more widely recognized because we are all interconnected. You know, we are interconnected technologically. Some of you are in the tech world. You know that better than most. And so we have a much clearer idea of both the challenges and the opportunities that are in our own neighborhoods, communities, and countries, and also those across the world. I don't think these are questions just to be answered by governments. In fact, I think that that would be a mistake. And so what I believe is that we need a much more robust, cooperative effort to bring people of good ideas and energy and values to the table to try to figure out how we are going to create enough jobs, how we are going to help prepare the next generation, no matter where they might live, to take their place in a fast-changing world. There's a lot to debate about this, but we're lacking a process right now that enables us to try to address those issues. And that's not just for some countries, it's really for everyone. And so what I'm hoping in our conversation today, and we can talk about leadership and all of the experiences that I've been privileged to have, but we can also talk about how we're going to address these big global issues. We're not going to get away from globalization. It is here. We're not going to be able to turn the clock back or put up a wall that keeps it out. We're not going to stop technology. And we're not going to stop some of the real quick-moving changes in technology, like even greater automation, greater use of robotics, greater influence of artificial intelligence in every aspect of our life. That is not going to stop. But how do we use it to the benefit of humanity? How do we use it to the benefit of the free exchange of goods and ideas that has historically been the route by which we make progress together? And you know as well as I that there is a strong counter reaction to a lot of this right now. Not just in elections, which we have lived through in England and the United States and are watching played out in Europe, but just in the anxieties people feel about this quick pace of change. And many of you are on the front lines of helping to make changes in the delivery of goods, in the invention of those goods, in the delivery of services. So how do we best harness that creativity, that entrepreneurial energy, so that we not only create opportunity and wealth, but we do it in an inclusive way that helps to lift even more people up in the economic opportunity ladder so that they have a chance to make the best decisions for themselves. You know, leadership is a subject that I think everybody should be talking about, because Leadership should rest on not just one's personal experiences and expertise, but on trying to create a common definition and a common purpose that can guide our future. And I hope that we will demand that from leaders, not only in government, but also in business, in academia, in journalism, in every walk of life. So with that, McKeel, I think we can have a conversation about anything that you and anyone else wishes to discuss. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you for those great comments about YPO.
Yes.
We're thrilled that you know a little bit about us and the things that we do. We take the subjects of that total picture of growth very seriously in the organization, because we talk about growing the whole person, and that's how you can affect people around you.
That's right.
But I guess, maybe just to start, I think I'd be remiss to not just ask one first question, which is, how are you doing?
Well, I'm out of the woods. Look, I said the other day that personally, I'm doing fine. I get the great privilege of spending time with my grandchildren, which I highly recommend. Most of you are too young, but eventually you'll get there. And it truly is better than parenting, because you do get to hand them back at the end of the day or the weekend. And I have a lot of wonderful relationships, my friends who have been just flocking around, spending time with me. So personally, look, I have no complaints. I mean, I'm very disappointed that the election didn't turn out differently, obviously, for a million reasons we could go into. But I also feel blessed. I mean, I've had the most extraordinary set of circumstances in my life, and I can't feel anything other than grateful. And I try to practice something I call the discipline of gratitude, because trying to think every single day, at the beginning and the end of the day, what you are grateful for, helps you create a kind of ongoing cycling of gratitude. And you talk about discipline, we think about that for things like eating or learning a sport and exercising, but I have found the discipline of gratitude to be perhaps the most rewarding kind of discipline I've ever tried to practice. So personally fine. I am worried. I'm worried about our country. I'm worried about some of the decisions that I think will have long-lasting damaging consequences, and I'm worried about some of the global trends that I see. So it's a mixed bag, I think, McKeel.
So, about the election, I guess, maybe you can help us frame some of your thinking around it, because, I'm 49 years old. I've voted in every election since I was old enough to vote in the United States, but this one really felt different. And, I think our obligation as leaders is we're often called to give context to the people around us, because it felt different. It felt scary at times, very, very adversarial. Was it different? How should we think about it?
Well, I'm actually in the midst of putting my thoughts down on paper about this, writing a book that at least gives my perspective about what happened. But I think it's an important question to ask, and people should be doing, as you say, thinking through what was similar, what was different about it. I can just tell you from my perspective, because I've been involved in politics and working on behalf of other people running for office, including for president, for many years. They've always been hard fought. They have always had lots of give and take, and people call politics a contact sport, and indeed it always has been. And you can go back in our history, and even in our most recent history, and of course see that. But there were always sort of unwritten but accepted norms and standards for behavior. And I would be the first to tell you that even I was shocked at seeing those disregarded. You saw the first indication of it from the very beginning of my opponent's campaign. attacking people just viciously, calling Mexicans names. I know there are people here from Mexico, using scapegoating, and then it just went on and on. And I think it was a very unfortunate but shrewd decision, because there is a lot of anxiety and anger and resentment and fear amongst people who worry that somehow they're going to be left behind, left out, overlooked. And so when you provide scapegoats, you really create a connection with somebody. You dislike the same people I do, therefore you and I have something in common. And that was just the theme from beginning to end. And then the kind of really unprecedented personal attacks starting in the Republican primary. And I know, a lot of the people who ran in the primary, and you could see how dumbfounded they were. And it was almost hard to know what to say and how to respond. And then, of course, the consistent drumbeat that started and continued to the very end against me, and the fake news, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, which played such an important role. But even having said all that, there have been vicious campaigns, there have been all kinds of attacks that candidates have carried out, one against the other. But there were unprecedented interventions in this campaign. And I've talked about it before, obviously I'll write about it. The intervention toward the very end by the FBI director was incredibly damaging. But then the constant intervention by the Russians. And I think the fact that we have not just a predominantly American, but also an international audience, the role that the Russians played, and if you listen to the testimony or read the accounts of the FBI director's appearance before Congress yesterday, he was specifically asked, is Russian interference continuing? And he said, yes. Now, they didn't go into any details, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it's clear that we're facing in a democracy an unprecedented level of meddling, interference, use of the internet to influence and maybe even determine elections. An investigation was just opened in France because of continuing Russian interference in their election. So this was unprecedented, both from a candidate's perspective, but also from a systemic perspective. And I am trying to make sense of it all and explain it because, look, I'm out of it. I understand that. I heard a great NPR interview with a French political analyst who was talking about the upcoming presidential election in France. And he concluded by saying, well, in our country, the person who wins the most votes wins, unlike yours. So I have, it's a small comfort, but I have a perspective that I am going to lay out and let other people lay out their perspectives. But I think that anybody, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, should be deeply concerned about the Russian interference.
Well, clearly it's, and we'll look forward to seeing your writings and thinking about it over time, but maybe switching gears to that next level about more of these global issues. Clearly these occurrences and sort of rising nationalism, populism, call it what you want, is affecting a lot of things in a lot of parts of the world. From all of your experience, how should we, it feels like it's, what do we attribute this to? How should we be thinking about that?
It's a great question. And again, this is, my perspective, and there's many others who have their own and have written about it, spoken about it. Look, I think that anytime there is a period of rapid change, there's going to be a reaction. That's almost a rule of physics, right, not just politics. And the reaction is in large measure because all the promises of globalization income creation, wealth acquisition, has demonstrably gone to a relatively small group of us, if you talk about the United States or you talk about the world. And who is most agitated about this? It is not the poor, it is the middle class. It was the middle class in our country, it's the middle class or those who feel they're falling out or have fallen out of the middle class in Europe, the Brexit vote, the French vote, the Belgian vote. You look at that and you know that there is a great deal of internal pressure on people who feel that maybe what's happened in the economy globally or in their own country or community has been rigged against them. Now, who does the rigging? Well, there are decisions made by people in politics and people in business that do disadvantage certain individuals and sectors of the economy. But much of that is because we haven't kept up, not out of any deliberate effort to set people back and undermine them, but we haven't kept up with what it means to run an inclusive economy with shared prosperity for more and more people every single year. We have lost sight of that as a primary goal. And because of that, there are legitimate questions that people are raising. And we haven't, I will speak just for our own country, we haven't come up with a good enough set of policies that give people the belief that somebody cares about them outside of their own very narrow world. I get that. I've seen it. Now, some of it is, they're very tough trade-offs. I mean, if you are a coal miner, there are now far fewer of you than there were a decade ago. There are more solar workers in America than there are coal miners. And so we can promise we're going to bring back coal, but the right promise should be we are going to move heaven and earth to create economic opportunity and to provide the skills and the education necessary for you to fulfill your own economic future. Unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction in our country. You know, the House just passed their repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It's disgraceful. It will engender even greater insecurity. It will create even greater financial burdens on people who have to get insurance in the individual market. And if we are right about what we think is in the bill, of course, nobody knows what's in it, it will also hurt the 130 million of us with pre-existing conditions. It will hurt the 170 million of us who get our health insurance from our employers. It will hurt the poor on Medicaid. It will hurt students with special education needs because taking care of them has largely been funded by Medicaid. You go down the list, and it is shocking, and it will only increase the amount of insecurity, anxiety, and therefore vulnerability to the kind of political populism, whatever you want to call it, that we've seen. So we're not getting the leadership right now that we need globally to say, you know what, I've got nothing against rich people. I happen to think that getting rich and being successful is a great goal for people. But we also are where we are because of the great middle class. And we have seen the real toll on the middle class. And so what are we going to do to grow that economy so that more and more people are successful and have the chance to climb that ladder, educationally and economically? So I think we're going in the wrong direction, and I think we will therefore see even more distrust and more acting out in the political system.
Okay. Thank you for that. So given our global audience here, I have a question from Vineet Agarwal from New Delhi, and he asks a question here. He saw considerable improvement in the U.S.-India relations under the last U.S. administration, and you're hearing, this what feels like sort of new strife as it seems to relate towards China. But how do you think, specifically, yes, here, how do you think the geopolitical and economic scenario will pan out given the historical India-China relations? That's a big
Oh,
one.
how
That's
much
a big
time
one.
do we
Yeah,
have,
well,
right?
Thanks, Vineet.
Yeah, thanks a lot, yeah.
And the rest of the time. There's Vineet right there. Guys.
Look, I mean, I think that the futures of India and China are critical, literally, to the future of the world. And economic growth and increasing prosperity is critical to the populations of both, but also to the role that they play in the world today. And there has been, as everyone knows, historical tensions between India and China. They're two huge countries with very strong identities and senses of their own potential. And so it's imperative that India and China look for some win-win opportunities as to how they can perhaps work together. I'll throw one out. China is investing enormously in renewable energy, predominantly solar. It's a real shame from my perspective because the United States should be the leader in solar and not be looking to the past. China is going to create the market, they're going to create the jobs and the products, and they will become a net exporter instead of the United States being a net exporter. That's my little American rant. So, China is investing in solar. India needs to leapfrog fossil fuels in its continuing drive for development. Indian cities and Chinese cities are among the most polluted in the world's history right now. China is trying very hard to diminish that pollution because it is terrible for children. It creates all kinds of health problems. So they are trying to tackle that. India is as well, but they don't have the investment yet in the technology. So India has an opportunity to really invest in new forms of energy and could do so perhaps through some kind of partnership with China. Some kind of, build some factories for solar, build some factories for wind, create some jobs in India, be able to take some of that market because it's going to be a huge market and it would be good for both India and China. My husband worked through the Clinton Foundation on putting in the largest solar field in India in Gujarat about 7 or 8 years ago. And that's where Prime Minister Modi is from. And so Bill and I have spoken with Prime Minister Modi. And he is, like many leaders, really trying to balance competing considerations. On the one hand, how many jobs can you create? How quickly can you move forward? And do you do it by building more coal plants? Or do you do it by building solar plants in India and wind plants and do everything you can to create those new jobs? Very tough choices. So I think that India and China are always going to be competitors because that's just part of life, but they could also be partners, and maybe fighting climate change and investing in renewable energy could be one of those areas for partnership, which would be win-win for both countries.
Well, that was pretty quick. You covered all of that, and just awesome. You've been incredibly passionate as an advocate for women's rights and children. We have a lot of very successful women who are leaders in our organization who are right here in the room. So I have a question for you from Elizabeth Zucker. Elizabeth, I think, is right back there, which is about do you feel, how do you frame the roles of women in leadership roles so that, and what would be the role models, or how could you model women in leadership in a way that you don't feel like you're having to come off as too strong or somehow too weak? It's this balancing act.
So let me just say a few things about it. Some of you may have read my friend Sheryl Sandberg's first book, Lean In. She's I'll give her a plug. She's got an amazing new book out about dealing with grief and being resilient, in her case, in the face of her very sudden loss of her husband. But in Lean In, Cheryl writes about this balancing act that McKeel just referenced. It's really hard to get it right. You know, if you're too strong, you turn people off. If you're too weak, you don't have leadership. If you speak too loud, nobody wants to hear you. If you speak too soft, people think you don't know how to speak. I mean, you just go down the dilemma on both sides of it. And having lived it now my entire life, it's real. And so the sort of the models for women's leadership are still much fewer than for men's leadership. I used to try lawsuits when I was a practicing lawyer back in Arkansas, and it was the same thing in the courtroom. You know, how do you connect with the jury? How do you make your case? And you always know that you're being evaluated. There's not a second that that's not happening. And so you just have to be as true to yourself as you can, but recognize that the balancing is not going away. And so you have to pursue your own dreams if you're in a business or running for office or whatever it might be. But I also think the rest of society has to let up a little bit. Give women the same opportunities to have different leadership styles as we give men. I mean, Donald Trump's leadership style is very different from Barack Obama's, which is very different from George W. Bush's, which is very different from Bill Clinton's. You go down the line, and you can look at Tim Cook's leadership style is very different from Jeff Bezos, which is very different from, you go down the line. So when you think about women's leadership, people need to understand that we are not all alike. We don't have the same experiences. We are all women, but that doesn't mean we don't bring different expertise, different interests to the table. So I would hope that maybe this election and some of the questions that are being raised about it can help prompt a conversation, because the fact is that there is still so much discrimination in the workforce and in the political world. I did a lot of campaigning and a lot of meeting out in Silicon Valley. And I give Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, a lot of credit, because he kept hearing people say, you know, women are not paid equally in Silicon Valley, even if they have the same level of education and experience. He said, well, that can't be true. And so he called up an analysis of Salesforce pay records, and he found it was. From entry level to PhD engineers, it was never equal. And so, you know, Mark said, hey, we got to fix this. And so did Oracle and a few other companies. But those are still the exceptions, not the rules. And so we've got to be more willing to say, what are my implicit attitudes that might be holding, you know, women back from being paid equally? And what can I do to make sure that the work environment is welcoming and supportive, men and women, so that people have the belief it's a meritocracy, and you do good work, you're going to get rewarded for that good work. But there's still too much evidence that that doesn't happen. I think one of the great advantages that the US has is our diversity. I think we are so blessed, and I met people here who live in New York but came from somewhere else originally. You know, immigrants start on average more jobs than people who are native born. Immigrants employ a lot of different people in those jobs on average. I mean, you go down the list, we have been so blessed by immigration over the course of our, you know, 230 plus years. And I think it's an advantage, because we bring to whatever table we're at, whether it's the economic or the political table, a sense of the greater world, and we have an ability to, you know, communicate and work with people from everywhere. So I just think it's in our interests. And you know, if you talk about women as being part of that, there's a lot of new evidence coming out that women on boards, women in senior management actually correlate with higher profits for many businesses. And I'll give you just a quick example. My daughter she's on the board of a company that's a healthcare delivery company, and I don't know what they're going to do now after the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. That's going to be a challenge. But she was telling me that one of the discussions was, well, how do you get good information to older people? And since women live longer than men, it's predominantly older women in choosing, Medicare Advantage or other kinds of healthcare plans. And she made the point, she said, talk to their daughters and their granddaughters, because they're the people who are going to be sitting with the older women, filling out those forms and helping to evaluate what works better than something else. So the whole idea of diversity is an economic plus, and it's tragic that the current administration has scapegoated immigrants and the many contributions that immigrants make, because that's not just wrong, but it's short-sighted, and it's going to hurt us economically.
Well, we have a lot of evidence for that in YPO, and we know we can do a lot better at it as well. So something we're very much working on. So I appreciate that very much. And speaking of YPO, I have a question from Randy Waterfield over here, who is the chairman-elect, the lucky guy who's following me in this role. And that is, YPO is a global organization. We have members all over the place. What could we be doing as an organization that could, not elevate our prominence? It's not a prominence issue, but that where we could have more of a seat at the table, where we could have more effect. We represent, in many ways, kind of the big, fat middle part of the market. We do have some very large companies, but in general, we're the kind of big employers around the world. So what are the things that we could be doing to have a more profound effect?
Well, that's a great question. One thing is to make it clear that more jobs are created by small and medium-sized businesses than by big businesses. And that's true not just in the United States, that's true globally. So you deserve a seat at the table. I mean, I make the case because it needs to be heard. Look, you're a very diverse group, which is one of the reasons why it's been a successful organization. If there's a way to pick one or two things, and we've talked about two things. We've talked about inclusivity and diversity in the workforce, and in leadership of companies, and we talked about renewable energy and climate change. Those are real challenges. And for YPO to maybe survey your members and say, out of this list of 10 things, would you like us to help you participate in decision making in your country, or to have a voice about what will make a difference economically, not just to you, but for the larger, growing the pie for the larger good. I think that would be really helpful. And I have to say that, historically, again, I know more about American business, but historically, American businesses did have such a voice. I'll give you one of my favorite examples. So my father was a very small businessman. He was a salesman before he went into the Navy in World War II. So he's in the Navy for 5 years, the war ends, he comes out and he decides he wants to start a small business. So he started a small drapery printing business. Bought the raw fabric, had the silk screens made, got a small factory with really long tables, rolled the material out and silk screen printed drapery fabrics. That's how he made his living. That's how, we were able to live in a really nice house in a nice middle-class suburb, et cetera. So after the end of World War II, under President Truman and General George Marshall and Secretary of State Dean Acheson, they concluded that it was in America's interest and the world's interest to help rebuild Europe, including our former enemies. What an audacious idea. And so they presented what later became known as the Marshall Plan. And it was people forget this, it was a small business lending plan to help businesses that had survived or that had been battered by the war, literally sometimes by bombing, to get back up on their feet in order to restart the economy. And so this idea meant that the very, very high rates of taxation that had been in place during the war would have to continue for a little while longer in order to jumpstart the European economy and by extension, the Asian economy, et cetera. So my dad, who was a rock-ribbed Republican, also though had a sense of community and a sense of patriotism. And I remember talking about, when I was studying the Marshall Plan in school, I remember talking to him about it because I learned that Marshall and Atchison and Truman went to business leaders and said, this is in your interest as well as our country's interest to get the global market going. So will you go speak at civic groups and other gatherings to convince people, to convince their representatives to vote for it? And I asked my dad what he thought. He said, look, I didn't want to pay those high taxes, but I also knew it was the right thing to do. Can you imagine what would happen today if an American president said, we need to have high taxes in order to rebuild or to build parts of the global economy, because the more economic activity we generate, the better it is for America. It's better not only economically, but it's better strategically, politically. I mean, honestly, they would never, if they ever were to come up with the idea, it would last a nanosecond. They'd be berated by commentators on TV and radio and the internet, and the chance to do something that had a long-term payoff but a short-term cost would be lost. So somehow, I don't know, in today's world where information is just bombarding us, I don't know how we make those long-term decisions in democracies. In state-run economies, you at least have the chance to make more long-term investments, but you have to be constantly trying to figure out how you keep people's expectations satisfied. But in a democracy, I don't know how you do it. So we've got to get back to trying to figure that out, that there are some things, there are so many things. Last thing I'll say on this, America's infrastructure is crumbling. If you came through JFK or you've been to LaGuardia or you tried to get on Amtrak, you know it. It's disgraceful and it's stupid. It costs us money. It costs us productivity. Every time planes are delayed because we don't have enough slots, or Amtrak, which is starved of maintenance, goes off the tracks. Whatever it is costly. And so are we going to have an infrastructure program, or are we just going to have a gigantic tax cut for people like my husband and me? It looks like we're heading toward the latter, not the former. And what a missed opportunity that will be. So we need some long-term thinking and long-term investments that push us in the right direction for the kind of benefits that will be broadly shared.
I have two more quick questions while we have time. Some people say the future's going to be in cities, that there's so much distrust actually for governments in these larger entities, and one more program I don't understand, and so on and so forth. Do you think there's any credence to that, or is it a pipe dream?
Look, I mean, I'm partial to cities because I won a lot of them, and so that gives me a bit of a bias towards cities. But here's what I do believe. I think you've got to develop every part of your country. You can't leave any parts out. So that in the United States, most of the growth that we're getting is in and around cities, and it's driving broader national growth, but it's really emanating from an environment in which there are enough talented people, enough creativity, innovation, hard work to really generate that kind of prosperity. And then it, to some extent, expands out. But we do have a lot of places in our country that are underserved and underperforming. And part of it is because we don't have the infrastructure, including the broadband infrastructure that covers every part. It doesn't cover every part of our country. So a lot of places can't really compete in the global economy the way that they should. So we do have to have strategies for rural and small town areas. But I think most of the growth is still going to come from and around cities. Now, not just giant cities like New York, they can be smaller cities, but they will have the creative class. If you haven't run across Richard Florida, he's an author worth reading because years ago he started talking about the creative class. So maybe there'll be a university that is throwing off investments and new products. So I think that you need a localized source of economic activity and innovation. Doesn't have to be in a big city, but that's where most have come to cluster. But you have to also obviously pay attention to what goes on outside those cities.
And it just may be the place that trust can be rebuilt on that local level.
You know, I would hope so, McKeel. I mean, one of the things you asked what I want to do, I don't know how I would do this, so I can't really speak specifically about it, but why are we in such opposing camps? Why are we so driven by partisanship when for most of these we should be looking at evidence? And I'm very, very unhappy, very disturbed about this vote today in the House. There was no evidence about what was in that bill and what it would cost. Usually when you're in the Congress, I served for 8 years in the Senate, you get what's called a Congressional Budget Office estimate. Now, it's not perfect, but it gives you a guideline. Okay, if you do this, it's going to cost that, or it's going to generate that. None of that. And yet, for purely partisan political purposes, people voted on something. I don't care, Democrats have done this too. I'm not being just concerned about Republicans, but this was particularly egregious because this is 1/6 of our economy. And it is healthcare for tens of millions of people, not just those on Medicaid, not just those on the exchanges, but in already existing employer plans. So there's something amiss. We have become so distrustful and so unwilling to reach across and listen to somebody who has a different political perspective that we're going to be paying, I think, for a long time, the cost of this. And my husband is a big fan of YPO. He has spoken, I think, in New York and California. LA. And, look, he balanced the budget. He left a surplus because he thought that would be the best possible basis for our country, our economy to move with confidence into the future. And now we're in a terrible deficit, an increasing debt. We're lucky because we still have safe currency and we have lots of financial advantages, but we are putting all that at risk too. So there's just so many of these questions that deserve honest, evidence-based answers. And that can only happen through a discussion where people put aside their prejudices and come to the table and say, look at the facts. And you know what, may be inconvenient for me, or they may be inconvenient for you, but let's try to work our way through this.
Awesome. So we're a learning organization, so I was wondering if you might, and you're known as a great reader and a student, so would you mind sharing with us a book you're reading right now that you might recommend? And here's the more tricky one. What's the book you'd give away most as a gift?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, what I'm really reading right now is a brand new book. It's called Jersey Brothers, and it's about 3 brothers who served in the Navy in World War II. And it is brilliantly written and very, incredibly compelling. One brother's working in the White House with Franklin Roosevelt, one's on the aircraft carrier, the Enterprise, and one's a prisoner of war in the Philippines. So it's a really extraordinary read. I just finished, I read mystery serials. I love Louise Penny and Donna Leone and all kinds of, mysteries. So I've just finished Donna Leone's latest, set in Venice. And I have given away a lot of different books, but probably the book I've given the most copies to refers back to something I said at the very beginning. It's a book by a Jesuit priest named Henri Nouwen, who wrote a book about the prodigal son parable in the New Testament. And that's where I got the phrase, the discipline of gratitude, from. I read that book back in the late 90s, when some of you might remember it was not an easy time for us. And it was just, it just, you know, you read something sometime and it just pierces you, and that really pierced me. So for friends of mine who've had some challenging times, whether cancer, death, divorce, I've given a copy of that book because I found it to be incredibly helpful to me.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for all of this. I hope it's been a great conversation, and I think we covered a lot of topics, and we went around the world there pretty quickly.
On behalf of the New York City chapter, we want to present you this award. This is our highest achievement award. Past winners are your husband and George W. Bush. So thank you so much for everything you've done for our country, and welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much.